Story 1. I was hit by an improvised explosive device and still have a lot of shrapnel inside my soft tissue. Emotionally, finding out about my wife's affair broke me. Story 2. Emotional pain can feel very physical. I understand there is a science behind it, but it can be an incredibly difficult experience. It's challenging to heal from this pain, especially when, years later, a smell can trigger a memory and make you relive that hurt. Story 3. Caring for my elderly mother with dementia at home by myself for her last 6 years was a journey of love and attention, just as she had given me throughout my life. It was emotionally, physically, and financially challenging, but I would do it all over again without hesitation if needed. Story 4. Being told I had cancer at 36 has made me feel the lowest I have ever been in my life. However, I remain hopeful that I can overcome this. Story 5. Mentally and emotionally, I would say grief due to the loss of a parent. Physically, it is definitely experiencing a toothache. Story 6. When I was pregnant with my third baby, his large head was pressing on my sciatic nerve for the last couple of months. I have broken bones, knocked out teeth, and even delivered him without pain medication, but that was by far the worst pain I have ever felt. Story 7. Scratched cornea. Worse than childbirth. Felt like glass was just floating around in my eyes. It was extremely painful. Story 8. The recent death of my younger brother was tragic. He was a victim of an abusive narcissist and was documenting the abuse he endured in order to secure a divorce and gain custody of the children, who were also being abused and neglected. My brother was writing a book titled, "A Man Can Be a Victim Too." He asked me to help him publish it, as his manuscript was almost complete. He died suddenly on February 16th under very suspicious circumstances. I cannot share more details right now, but I intend to keep my promise and tell his story, even without his manuscript, which I am certain was found and deleted. There is so much to this story. He was also sharing his experiences on social media. His story is heartbreaking. Although his voice was silenced, I plan to ensure it is heard. Story 9. My son was sexually abused by his teacher. It was a horrific experience, especially since he is nonverbal and has special needs. The entire process was terrible. They were also placing him in a seclusion room where he would lose control and harm himself. We were unaware of what was happening, which may sound unbelievable, but I only discovered the truth after I unexpectedly visited the school and found him in one of the rooms. His entire personality changed. He is no longer at that school and is now homeschooled. This occurred 5 years ago, and it was incredibly painful and heartbreaking. Story 10. I have broken several bones, dislocated a shoulder, and undergone a few surgeries, and none of it was really that bad. Nothing was severe enough to make me scream or cry. I experience migraines a few times a year, and they might be the worst. They turn me into a whiny person. Story 11. I had surgery on my back, and 2 or 3 days later, the staples keeping the wound closed had a problem, causing my wound to reopen. It wasn't a fun time, let me tell you. Story 12. Gallstones. I was at the airport once and had a gallstone attack. I was writhing on the floor in agony, making a huge scene. Then it stopped, and I boarded the plane anyway. Honorable mention, when I was a teenager, I was pitching in a baseball game. Someone hit a line drive directly into my shin. I was also writhing on the ground in pain. Story 13. Betrayal and later loss of someone I loved dearly. The loss hurt, of course, but the betrayal hurt more. Combined, it was devastating. Edit. I see now that you might have been asking about physical pain. Story 14. Fibromyalgia crisis. Imagine the worst toothache. Now imagine that pain throughout your entire body, to the point where any movement causes even more discomfort. It is a debilitating condition. Story 15. Physically, I swung my leg off the hospital bed after a week of elevation to reduce swelling from a broken ankle sustained in an offshore work accident. Took a while to get to the hospital. After a week without much blood flow, every nerve ending in my leg and foot painfully reacted to receiving a fresh supply of blood. It was agonizing, and I apologize for my language, but it was undoubtedly the worst physical pain I have ever experienced. Mentally, at that time, I was dealing with the death of my grandmother in my early 20s. We were very close, and her death from cancer was incredibly difficult. The doctors ultimately withdrew the feeding, and it still took her 3 weeks to pass. She was an amazing and resilient person, but I had to say goodbye to what felt like a skeleton. Later, I witnessed my daughter going through major spinal surgery in her teens, with my mother unable to do anything for her. My daughter endured a week of traction and pain before a 6-hour surgery, with uncertainty surrounding the outcome. That week was without question the worst of my life. The good news is that the surgery was successful, and my daughter is now 23 and thriving. However, my grandmother is still gone. Story 16. I'm 25 years old. I used to think the most painful experience I had gone through was my trauma and all its ramifications, as well as the process of working through it. However, losing my mom almost 2 weeks ago has brought me some of the worst pain I've ever felt. Today is Mother's Day, and I miss her. Story 17. Kidney stone. When I got my Mirena inserted, I nearly passed out. It did not feel good. Story 18. I had hernia repair surgery the traditional way. Nearly 40 stitches, staples, and a binding were all that was keeping me from spilling my insides. It hurt, understandably, so they gave me opioid painkillers, which caused constipation. 3 days after the surgery, I had yet to have a bowel movement, so they gave me a laxative. The next day, I took another laxative. On the 5th day after surgery, I suddenly had to go badly. I hobbled my way to the bathroom, and the cramps and pushing were causing intense discomfort. The pain was severe, making me feel nauseous. As I was trying to push this significant obstetric challenge out, the nausea suddenly had me retching and heaving. This caused spasms in some abdominal muscles that had just endured considerable trauma. There, in a hospital bathroom, I was throwing up into a trash can while my healing abdomen felt like it was being invaded by red-hot wires. That was the worst pain I've ever felt. Story 19. Overall, the death of my husband is a difficult topic. I experienced physical pain from third-degree burns followed by skin grafts, and that is incredibly painful. Story 20. The most painful physical thing I ever experienced was when I accidentally pepper-sprayed myself with a small bottle I had attached to my keys. Let me tell you, it works. The most painful emotional experience I ever faced was being cheated on by someone I never thought would do such a thing. It left me with chronic trust issues that linger to this day. Story 21. Grief is physically and mentally taxing. It rarely gives you a break, and just when you think you might be okay, it comes back for another round. Story 22. My mother has untreated borderline personality disorder, which leads her to behave in a narcissistic manner, and the family accommodates and believes her. She is the only one who matters, and they genuinely would not care if I died. Story 23. Being physically, verbally, mentally, and emotionally abused by 5th-grade teachers in front of the entire class. Story 24. Necrotic ovary with severe pain accompanied by writhing, sweating, and hyperventilating. The rebound test in the emergency room was extremely painful. Story 25. The loss of my dad was unexpected, and it felt like a gut punch. At least my mom lived until she was 95, but my dad was younger and we were very close. Story 26. I had an injury that affected a nerve due to a sharp object. Felt different. I even touched it and experienced tingling in my fingers for a while. Story 27. It's a toss-up between a copperhead bite on my foot, as it was in my shoe and bit me twice, envenomating both times, and the placenta abruption I experienced while pregnant with my now 16-year-old child. Story 28. I experienced a kidney stone and went into labor for 38 hours, which ended in a cesarean section. The kidney stone developed about a week before the procedure. I passed the kidney stone through the catheter after the cesarean section. Story 29. Physically, I felt the first incision of my cesarean section. It's been nearly 13 years, and I still haven't forgotten. Emotionally, 2 of my favorite students died for unrelated reasons. I couldn't have saved the first since it was a medical issue, but I'll always wonder if I could have saved the second. Story 30. Losing my dad at 16 affected me in ways I still struggle to explain. I didn't know how to cope with it at that age. Story 31. My wife died right in front of me. We were gardening when a tree fell and killed her instantly. This happened this past Easter Sunday. Story 32. Pilonidal cysts can be quite debilitating. My first one grew to the size of a lemon and was so deep that the wound had to be packed with 15 feet of gauze. I still shudder thinking about the day after surgery when we had to remove it all to replace the dressing. Story 33. I had a dental, sinus, and facial infection after surgery inside my mouth. The pain was constant and excruciating, as if my entire face and brain were on fire. The hospital did not manage my pain effectively. I was supposed to receive pain relief every 2 hours, but at times I was left for 6 to 8 hours without any medication. It was so unbearable that I wished for an end to the pain. My brother had to intervene with the hospital staff and teach me how to properly schedule my pain medication and to pull the response cord in advance to ensure I didn't run out of relief. It was the worst experience of my life. Story 34. Bowel obstruction. I lost consciousness from the pain, and when I woke up, an ambulance officer was asking my wife if I had a do not resuscitate order. That was a difficult night. Story 35. I had a Foley catheter placed to help open my cervix because I was not dilating. Then, my cervix still would not open enough, so the doctor had to manually assist in the dilation. I remember screaming loudly and feeling my eyes roll back. I do not recommend this experience. Story 36. Injection of rooster comb in my knee. Emotionally, my ex-husband's affair and our subsequent divorce. Story 37. A wisdom tooth is growing sideways, and its root is gently touching a nerve along my jaw. It felt like half my jaw was on fire, and there were breaks that made it difficult to get used to the pain. Story 38. A suprapubic catheter with over 1,600 milliliters of urine in my bladder. A kidney stone had blocked my urethra. I worked all day, and when I got home, I had to urinate urgently but couldn't. I went to the emergency room where they did a bladder scan and said I was completely full. To make matters worse, they gave me an intravenous diuretic, which made me feel like I had to urinate even more. I was wide awake while they inserted a long metal tube through my lower abdomen into my bladder. Yes, fun times. Story 39. I have experienced 2 toothaches that were unbearable, but I believe the worst pain I had was from gallstones. That was absolutely crippling. Story 40. I have a dietary intolerance to onions. Onions have a similar effect on my stomach as Alka-Seltzer does in water. One night when I was a child, I ate 3 to 4 slices of pepperoni pizza, not realizing that it contained concentrated onion powder. As a result, the normal effects of my intolerance were intensified. That night, I ended up in agony, sitting on the toilet for about 3 hours, with my face literally pale from the pain. Story 41. Physical pain. 1. Kidney stones without medical intervention. Trigeminal neuralgia, which is difficult to explain. A shingles outbreak behind my eye. I would not wish any of these on anyone. Story 42. I have experienced kidney stones, an internal abscess with sepsis, multiple broken bones, dislocations, and migraines, but the most painful for me was crushed bones. In 7th grade, I fell during physical education at 9 a.m. and managed to fold my wrist flush against my forearm on the ground, crushing it inward completely. It honestly didn't hurt in the moment. I remember staring at the grass, unable to move until my classmates picked me up. I wasn't in pain initially, but my wrist looked terrible, so I went to the office. My mother had surgery the day before, so I had to wait for my grandparents. I was in complete shock. It was hard to answer questions. My pain didn't feel worse than a bruise unless I tried to move. Thankfully, my grandmother worked for the best orthopedic specialists in the city, and they picked me up after lunch. I managed to crush most of the bones in my wrist as well as the ends of my radius and ulna. They didn't even try to count the pieces. I was given morphine at the office, placed in the largest, thickest cast I've ever seen, prescribed oxycodone, and sent home from school for 6 weeks. The pain began around 3 a.m., and to this day, I have never felt something so excruciating. I went from being in a pain medication-induced, shocked, exhausted sleep to screaming in just minutes. I could actually feel the crushed, loose bones moving inside my body with the slightest shift of my arm, and I was casted to my shoulder, and my hand was so swollen I couldn't bend a finger, so I couldn't move much at all. Imagine shards of bone that you can individually feel cutting into your internal tissue and rubbing against each other. Over the next few weeks, there were times when I would simply pass out from the pain of being jostled, since I'm still clumsy and ran into things. I was in a cast for over a year and ended up with an emaciated arm. I underwent extensive physical therapy to regain strength and motion, but after a few years my arm still bent 80 degrees to the outside, had a large ulnar bump, and caused so much pain that I struggled to complete schoolwork by hand. I needed surgery on my wrist. They restructured my wrist bones, realigned my ulna by 60 degrees, and removed 6 centimeters of bone from my ulna, using 3 plates and 16 screws in total. Thankfully, recovery from the surgery was much easier. Now, I still have an oddly shaped wrist and a noticeably shorter right arm, but my pain usually isn't too severe. Either way, I highly recommend against crushing your bones and joints. If you do, be sure you don't have a mother who just had surgery, so you can get reconstructive surgery right away. Story 43. I am experiencing it now. It's watching my mom suffer and die from stage 4 cancer in her lung, liver, and brain. I have had many surgeries and 2 children, but this is the worst kind of pain I have ever felt. I am so angry at God, at everything, and everyone. I feel no one understands. If I could change places with her, I would, because she is so sweet. She always does for others, is very kind, and has no enemies except this cancer. She does not deserve to die this way. She has definitely left her mark on people's lives and has helped change them. It's not fair at all. I just want to hold on to her and never let go. This is as painful as ever. I try to be strong, but it's getting harder each day. Story 44. My mother became homeless when my brother was 2 years old and was pressured by Child Protective Services to put him on a fast track for adoption, severing her rights because she wasn't sure when she would be able to afford adequate housing again. 8 years later, I received a phone call from his caseworker saying he was having behavioral issues, had been removed from his adoptive parents, and needed immediate temporary placement. Neither my mother nor I had our own place at that time, but we still attempted to organize visitation. The caseworker gave us the runaround, and I have not seen my brother in almost 10 years because I didn't live with my mother when all this was happening. The caseworker claimed he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and fetal alcohol syndrome. I fully understand the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. However, fetal alcohol syndrome is not possible because my mother did not drink during any of her pregnancies. My mother and I have been trying to get back in contact with the caseworker for months, but she has completely ignored us and refuses to answer. There has been no word from her despite multiple phone calls and messages. Fast-track adoption policies are a form of child trafficking. Story 45. When I had my first surgery at 15, I woke up during it. At 22, a sharp object went halfway through my shin and wedged the bone. When I was 25, my baby sister died. I became so depressed that I passed on one of my dream jobs. Story 46. Physical pain from breast augmentation is worse than natural childbirth. Emotional pain from the loss of a father is worse than 2 divorces. Story 47. IUD retrieval was worse than 2 separate childbirths with no medication, admittedly fast deliveries, and kidney stones. Story 48. Cerebrospinal fluid leak after a lumbar puncture was quite painful. Lying still caused moderate pain, while any movement resulted in excruciating head pain from the brain rattling around due to insufficient fluid for protection. This lasted about 24 hours. Story 49. Acute kidney failure. I was on life support for almost a week in the intensive care unit. I also had methemoglobinemia and hemolytic anemia. My lips and fingers were blue, and my eyes were yellow. It was the kind of pain where you beg the nurse to help end your suffering. Story 50. Honestly, being in a serious relationship for 6 years with someone who had borderline personality disorder has changed me forever. Story 51. I developed a yeast infection under both breasts after my breast reduction, resulting in a yeast infection on open wounds. Story 52. I returned from boot camp and proposed to my girlfriend, who accepted. She then informed me that she was 2 months pregnant with my child. Felt like I was walking in a dream. We had an amazing night, but the following morning, I had to fly out for advanced training on the other side of the United States. I tried calling her, but she didn't answer. I texted, but received no response. A few days passed and I reached out to her parents, but they did not reply. I tried contacting her brother, but nothing. Finally, I took leave, and the night before my flight to see her, I received a letter containing the ring I had proposed to her with. Tragically, when she left my place that morning, she was hit head-on by a drunk driver and killed. Her parents blamed me. I went from the happiest moment of my life to the darkest and most painful. Story 53. Serious depression. Every day I wake up wishing I didn't. I wish I didn't feel this way because I have family who cares for me. But living in my mind is miserable. Story 54. Loss of 9 friends to a mass shooter who used to be a friend as well. The police killed him at the scene. The hypervigilance was all-consuming in the following months and years. Watching a parent or grandparent struggle with dementia, especially when they are violent. Endometriosis, infertility, in vitro fertilization, appendix rupture, childbirth. Betrayal by a spouse, followed by betrayal by a close friend. Loss of a child. Struggling mentally with obsessive-compulsive disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and sound sensitivity. Story 55. Losing my grandparents 6 months apart has been incredibly difficult. My grandmother passed away almost 1 month ago, and it still does not feel real at times. They raised me since I was 2 years old, and now I am 22. They won't be here to see me graduate, get married, or have children. It hurts my heart every time I think about it. I miss them dearly. They were a true blessing. Story 56. Pancreatitis from excessive drinking put me in the hospital 3 times before I finally made a change. Story 57. My ex-wife had an affair, and the divorce that followed was filled with betrayal and devastation unlike anything I had ever experienced. Story 58. I just had a crown placed on a tooth. They first put on a temporary crown, for which I was numbed. Then, a week later, a permanent crown was installed. They removed the temporary crown and had to blow air onto the exposed tooth to cement the new crown. There was no numbing involved, and it was the most painful experience I have ever had. Story 59. As far as the pain goes, there reaches a point where it can't hurt more than it already does. I've experienced a few of those. Severe acute necrotizing pancreatitis, tooth pain, kidney stones, broken floating ribs in my back spasms, and various other breaks and sprains. The worst total experience was the pancreatitis, closely followed by kidney stones. The other issues will heal in a relatively set time span. However, that particular type of pancreatitis is different because you have to deal with the risk of sepsis and potentially dying. You can't eat or drink, and being in the intensive care unit means you won't get any rest. There are worse things that go along with it, but overall, I'd rather have kidney stones. Story 60. After major surgery and being released from the post-anesthesia care unit to the recovery room, my intravenous drip stopped working. I lost track of time, unable to fully wake up due to a lack of medication and excruciating pain, which caused me to keep passing out. My aunt was there and said I barely spoke. I just groaned and fell back asleep repeatedly. The nurse only noticed later when she came in to tell me I needed to wake up and prove I could walk so my aunt could take me home. Despite barely being able to stay awake, she made me sit up, and I threw up and passed out from the pain. That's when she realized I hadn't been receiving any medication and switched my 4 to 1 that worked. Story 61. Gout. I have had surgeries where the doctors told me the outcome would be one of the most painful experiences, and it did not compare to the pain of gout. Story 62. A leak after a lumbar puncture resulted in too much cerebrospinal fluid around my brain, leading to severe pain. Story 63. My dad is dying. For something that isn't physical, it feels like someone has ripped my heart into shreds and punched holes in my lungs. Physically, he is experiencing heart failure and will need a heart transplant. Story 64. My birth mother told me to never contact her again when I first reached out. She was cold. That hurt for many years. Story 65. A childhood friend developed locked-in syndrome due to complications from surgery and eventually passed away. Story 66. My parents' deaths were difficult experiences. I think my dad's passing was more painful because it was unexpected, and I was so young, around 16 or 17. My mom's death also hurt deeply, but we knew it was coming. Story 67. Becoming a widow before I was 30. Not making it to the hospital before my mother passed. Watching my father die right in front of me. Story 68. Losing someone you are deeply in love with is profoundly painful. When they tell you they no longer want you in their life, it strikes your heart with great intensity. Story 69. Before I was on birth control, I used to experience period pain so intense that it would feel like my legs were about to give out. Surprisingly, it was not endometriosis or any other common causes. Instead, my joints felt like they were forcibly separating as I bled, draining my strength and coordination, and at one point even affecting my vision. I spent days crying on the floor, feeling as though my hips were being slowly dislocated. It was not just psychological. I could feel tension in my skin too as my joints struggled apart. Using the bathroom felt like I was on the verge of tearing something, as if I were giving birth, and I had to physically try to bring my hips closer together to alleviate that pain when I sat down. I've heard that the sensation of loose hips is actually reminiscent of early labor pains. So I can only imagine that once I have a child, that experience will take precedence. Story 70. Losing my Mastiff was incredibly difficult. She was with me for nearly 8 years, staying by my side when my husband was deployed and sleeping under my son's crib. Every trip, nap, and walk, she was always there. I miss her every day. Story 71. I fractured my femur in a car accident. Unfortunately, the pain medication in the hospital did not relieve much of the pain. Story 72. Parent, my will to continue at times has been tested because someone else completely derailed my life when I was about 6 years old. Any desire to succeed at work has diminished. It's all very painful, and the physical injuries from the table saw accident really hurt, but the emotional pain is worse. Anyway, I have no good answers. Story 73. Depends. I've had kidney stones twice, but a couple of years ago my back seized from top to bottom with a total spasm. These 3 experiences resulted in trips to the hospital for pain relief. Story 74. Rotted tooth. I was 17 and begging my mom to take me to the dentist for a severe cavity that eventually caused my entire tooth to rot from the inside out. When I finally had it pulled, it was just the shell of a tooth, and my nerve was exposed. Story 75. I had a broken leg and a shattered ankle that required 2 surgeries, a plate, and 6 pins to repair. The first hospital I visited sent me home in a cast, and that was all. I was in agony. My leg swelled and nearly burst out of the cast. I went to another hospital for a second opinion. They admitted me for a week and performed 2 surgeries. The surgery to reconstruct my ankle took more than 8 hours. I was informed that if I had continued with just the cast and had not sought another provider, I would likely be walking with a permanent limp if I could walk at all. The worst part was when it started healing and I would experience cramps. Cramps in the aftermath of fresh surgery with metal in my leg. It wasn't painful, but it was quite sickening to feel the bones rubbing against each other. Additionally, I dislocated both knees within a year. I am not sure when I sustained the injury, but I later found out that I have a chronic anterior cruciate ligament tear and a fractured kneecap. That was probably even more painful than the leg break initially, making it a close second. Story 76. Blocked gallbladder, 103 degrees Fahrenheit fever, and jaundice. If you experience 3 weeks of diarrhea and sudden weight loss, with yellow stool resembling pancake batter and tenderness on the right side, along with yellowing of the nails and eyes, seek medical attention immediately. You could be in a life-threatening condition. You can live without a gallbladder, but the last few hours may be very uncomfortable. Story 77. I lost my dad when I was 24. I watched different ailments slowly take over his body for 3 years, but I still wasn't ready. He never got to walk me down the aisle or hold his grandchildren, and I know he would have been the best grandfather. Story 78. I ruptured a femoral hernia on Monday when I picked up a 40-pound box. My appendix somehow got entangled in it. It was the worst pain I have ever experienced, including childbirth. I am recovering from emergency surgery now. Story 79. Bilateral facial pain from trigeminal neuralgia has persisted from morning to night since early 2019, along with the loss of my dog a few days before Christmas last year. Story 80. I had an umbilical hernia for years. It meant nothing more to me than going from an innie to an out tie. One morning, while I was getting ready for work, I suddenly experienced extreme stabbing pain. Bent over, I could barely move, as if a knife had plunged into my gut. I went to the emergency room where the attending surgeon said that since it wasn't strangulated, it wasn't urgent. But the pain was overwhelming. Fortunately, my general practitioner found a surgeon who could fix it a couple of days later. I suspect women between childbirth and menstrual issues might consider me weak, but I was so glad my doctor listened to me and acted. Story 81. Emotional pain can lead to the darkest depths of depression, including dissociation and an inability to differentiate between being awake and asleep. Physically, I experienced a painful steroid shot in my foot, which was excruciating but only lasted 30 minutes. Alternatively, I have dealt with severe chronic constipation, which has made me contemplate drastic measures to relieve my discomfort. Many have told me that this condition can be worse than childbirth, making it a difficult decision to determine which experience is more challenging. Story 82. Hugging my dad as he took his last breath, I reflected on his incredible positivity and fighting strength. He turned a diagnosis of 6 months into 3.5 years. Story 83. My dad, who was also my best friend, died at the scene 3 minutes after being hit by a motorcyclist while crossing the street. I was not able to say goodbye. I arrived at the scene and tried to console my mother, who was by his side throughout it all. My baby was 10 months old, and my dad didn't get to see her first birthday or her first steps. I could go on, but it is the worst pain ever. It's been 9 months, and the pain still feels as fresh. Story 84. Labor for 38 hours. My husband's terminal illness and death. My daughter losing her father. He is losing the chance to see her grow up. Story 85. Life-threatening chronic hypophosphatemia can cause significant weakening and softening of bones. It's a distressing condition. Thankfully, I began my recovery in April. Story 86. When I was 16, I was diagnosed with a lifelong genetic condition that will cause me constant pain until the day I die. It has been the most painful experience I have ever endured, both physically and emotionally. Story 87. My mom passed away when I was 9. I barely knew my dad because he was always working, so we didn't know how to support each other beyond just surviving. That scar made me who I am today, and it remains a tender wound that I don't think will ever fully heal. Almost 50 years later, I still get emotional when I think of her. Story 88. I received a call from my mom one morning, sobbing and screaming that my dad had passed away. It was completely unexpected. He suffered a heart attack due to a heart disease he did not disclose to us. The image of my mom walking into her room to get ready for work and finding her husband dead on the floor haunts me. Story 89. The loss of my twins was difficult. I don't want sympathy, but it brought back painful memories. I struggle with infertility. I have a son now, but I still feel the impact of my past. I was told multiple times that I might not be able to have children. I tried for 3 years, and it was a challenging time. I didn't deserve to go through that. The twins were not the only loss I experienced. I lost so much that year. Thankfully, I can say that I am no longer in that place, physically or mentally. Story 90. I had a challenging pregnancy journey. My first pregnancy ended in a partial miscarriage. I lost one baby but managed to carry the other. We tried again, but due to high stress, I miscarried the second pregnancy. Finally, I had a third successful pregnancy without complications, which was considered a healthy, normal pregnancy. I was resting at 23 weeks along, and my parents were supposed to watch my 3-year-old son. He tried to surprise me because he missed me and landed full force on my belly. My son was born prematurely after 4 days of pain and unfortunately passed away after struggling to live. He lived for only 21 days. It hurts so much knowing my oldest was involved, but I do not blame him. He was young. While parents often blame themselves, it was an accident we never anticipated. And I won't blame anyone, including my son. I will never tell him about it. I now have a rainbow baby, but it doesn't ease the pain. I still cry randomly as I miss my angel. Story 91. My son was kidnapped by his mother and moved from the European Union to Russia. Every day feels like hell as I fight to get him back. Story 92. Hematometra. It was a side effect of a uterine ablation. Scar tissue grew over the entrance and trapped menstrual blood for months. The pain was intense. 800 milligrams of ibuprofen did nothing for it, so I would purposely take 1,200 milligrams, which was dangerous, I know. I was misdiagnosed as having an inflamed bladder. I eventually went to the emergency room after a month of horrific pain, and it was found on an X-ray. My gynecologist drained my uterus in the office. She offered surgery, but I couldn't wait that long. They had to open my uterus and drain me. I joked that I was getting an oil change. I immediately felt relief. Story 93. The loss of my mother. The betrayal of my father. The realization that my stepson has no remorse for lying and using people. Story 94. Physically, it was surgery without anesthesia. Doctors would not believe me and insisted I had to be awake for the procedure until I bent the metal table to ensure I didn't move. Apparently, my sobbing was seen as attention-seeking. Childbirth was easier. Mentally and emotionally, it was my mom telling me I should have taken my own life to make everyone else's life easier. I went completely no contact after that. Story 95. The death of my abusive husband left me devastated. When I learned how he died, I felt a profound sadness. He was found alone by a stranger in a dark alley and taken to the hospital, where no one knew his identity. He passed away in the emergency room on a stretcher, without anyone by his side. No one held his hand. Even though he treated me poorly and wronged me on many levels, he did not deserve to die alone. No one deserves to die alone. He was a broken man, desperate and unhappy, but still he did not deserve this fate. I remember when I found out about his passing. Despite years of abuse, my mother and mother-in-law went to identify his body. I had the chance to say goodbye over the phone while working abroad. I told him that I forgave him and was sorry for how he departed. I regretted that he was alone, and I reminded him that he was loved and would always be loved. I acknowledged that he was finally free from his inner struggles. I survived his abuse but never hated him, a sentiment I struggle to understand or explain. His death shattered me completely. Story 96. I fell down a small cliff, broke my ankle, scraped my chest on the rocks, and then fell into the sea. It was like salt in the wounds, and I faced about a 2-mile crawl across the sand to get help. Story 97. In 2017, I would have said the death of my father. But then, in 2022, the day after my 47th birthday, I lost my mother as well. It is a strange experience to feel orphaned later in life. Story 98. Around 4 days after spinal surgery, I was being lifted out of a hospital bed when one of the straps slipped off the lift. My body dropped rapidly, and the impact was all on my back. The scream I let out made my dad start crying, and he had to leave to collect himself. Whenever I see a pain chart, I always use that moment as my reference for a 10. Story 99. Emotionally, it was losing my parents. Physically, it was when I dropped a hammer on my big toe. I was barefoot at the time and broke it in 2 places. Story 100. Going to the hospital for 2 weeks and undergoing surgery, then witnessing a family member fight cancer. Story 101. For me, it was having plates and screws put in my ankle after a car accident. It was unbearable without some kind of pain relief. Story 102. Having my first love say, "I don't see a future with you," after we moved in together 2 months earlier completely shattered me mentally. I have abandonment issues and I am still healing from it, to be honest. Story 103. My daughter was diagnosed with an incurable, lifelong chronic disease at the age of 10. The emotional pain overwhelmed me. Story 104. Physically, it felt like a car was running over my foot, and the liquid combined with the gel needle during my surgery made it seem as though I was being torn apart inside. Psychologically, I dealt with the loss and near loss of loved ones. Story 105. Giving birth without an epidural was somewhat quick. It happened too quickly to receive an epidural. Story 106. I have been abused in every way possible. I have had a chest tube inserted and two removed while fully awake. I chose the wrong man to be a father for my beautiful children. I have lost everyone I loved, including my closest friends, one of whom was in my life for 27 years. Story 107. This horrendous stomach ache wasn't severe, but it hurt a lot. I rushed to the emergency room originally thinking it was appendicitis, but even the doctors couldn't figure out what it was. That was several years ago, but I wonder from time to time if it will ever come back. Story 108. I fractured my kneecap, and it swelled instantly. To reduce the swelling, they inserted a large needle behind my kneecap to drain the fluid 3 times. The pain felt like hitting your funny bone but lasted non-stop for 20 minutes. Story 109. I had a hemorrhoidectomy that became infected. Everyone experienced in that said the surgery alone was the worst thing ever, but theirs didn't get infected. It was supposed to be a very painful 10 days, but it turned into a challenging 4 months. As a runner-up, I had a kidney stone that was so large it had to be surgically removed through my urethra. Story 110. I suffered from sciatica for a solid year, which left me with partial paralysis. Emotionally, I faced challenges that are difficult to express. There are some things I choose not to discuss. Additionally, I experienced the deaths of 3 men, each of whom I had intended to marry. One died of cancer after we met, another in a car accident, and the third from an accidental overdose of antidepressants while drinking. The death of my grandmother was the most painful of all. She was my confidant and support. Story 111. 2 things. 1. They were accusing me of something I didn't do in high school. Hitting your pinky toe on a sofa. Story 112. Losing my son after a tragic incident that caused him to become hypoxic during his birth has been the hardest thing I have ever experienced. I still have no conclusive answers about what happened. Story 113. My hand was half submerged in a deep fryer at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. I sustained a second-degree burn that took a while to heal. I am disappointed by how little it scarred. I went through all that pain and have the story. I should have something to show for it. Instead, I have a slightly discolored patch on my hand that is hard to notice most of the time. Story 114. Probably open heart or intestinal surgeries. Fun fact. A doctor saws right through your sternum for heart surgery. Story 115. Pancreatic episode. I was unable to breathe. It was excruciating. Delivering a baby is child's play compared to this. Story 116. Physically, I had my foot reset and tilted upwards after breaking my tibia and fibula and dislocating my ankle so that the cast could be placed for proper healing. I screamed in pain, and the surgeon appeared genuinely annoyed. The morphine had no effect. Story 117. My dad was murdered in 2000. He was 60 years old and was walking home from attending his local Royal British Legion Club in Blackpool, UK. It was about 11 p.m., and he was only 5 minutes away from home when he was ambushed by 3 men, who beat and robbed him. He died from his injuries, and the 3 men were arrested. They were charged with my dad's murder. Story 118. Divorce was a difficult decision for me, and a decade later, I still face the life-changing pain. This pain is not due to heartache or a physical injury, but rather the reality that sociopaths exist. My children's future will never be what I worked so hard to provide for them. They are doing okay, but we feel that pain every single day. There is no escape until the other party is gone, and even then, the damage is already done. The effects can be generational. Mental illness and substance abuse are real issues. Story 119. I was in the emergency room with a perforated intestine until I passed out. I woke up with a colostomy bag and a tube down my throat. Story 120. I once dreamt that I was doing a sliding tackle in football and, for some reason, performed the movement while sleeping. I kicked the brick wall my bed was against with full force. I woke up screaming in pain and utterly confused about what had just happened. Story 121. Physically, it felt like a horse tripping at a full gallop and somersaulting on top of me, followed by us skidding a distance before eventually stopping. Emotionally, it was heartbreak. I would prefer having my entire body broken and crushed by a horse any day over that. Story 122. I had testicular torsion. It was an intense experience. Once it happened, my vision narrowed into a small circle. I was covered in cold sweat, and the pain medication did nothing. It wasn't until they administered ketamine that I stopped feeling the pain, but even then, the discomfort persisted. I actually drove myself to urgent care while it was twisting. During the ultrasound of my testes, when they applied the cold gel with my knees in the air, the torsion finished. The nurse gasped as a chaotic situation unfolded in my scrotum, and she quickly left the room. She witnessed what was happening. I could barely see or speak when a doctor holding a sandwich stumbled into my room, looked at me, glanced at the monitor image, and shouted for an ambulance down the hall. I was in surgery about 30 minutes later, and they informed me that I almost lost one of my testes. I would still rather experience that again than be cheated on or unexpectedly broken up with by someone I love. Story 123. Physically, childbirth was challenging as my child had a large head. Emotionally, I am still coping with the death of my husband almost 2 years ago. I am not okay, but I am seeing a grief counselor and persevering. Story 124. Physically, kidney stones are painful. Emotionally, I experienced the loss of my cat, my best friend for 10 years, who died of cancer. Story 125. The first time I experienced anaphylactic shock, it was just terrible stomach pain, so I didn't think much of it since I have dealt with that my whole life. Fast forward 45 minutes later, I found myself in a hospital bed, writhing in pain to the point where they had to hold me down to administer the epinephrine. Then they used fentanyl to help me calm down. Let this be a lesson to anyone who reads this. Anaphylaxis due to an allergic reaction does not only manifest as throat constriction. Story 126. Physically, I experienced pain and neuropathy after foot surgery. Emotionally, I faced a difficult time when my son nearly died from a massive brain bleed. The surgeon informed me that his chances of survival were slim. Tomorrow marks the 1-year anniversary of the surgery that saved his life. It was both my worst and best Mother's Day. Story 127. Being by both my parents' side when they passed, seeing the life leave their eyes and watching them diminish. Nothing can prepare you for that. I wouldn't wish it on my enemy. Sending love to the broken. Story 128. Physically, I was beaten up and almost killed. In 7th grade, I was openly LGBTQIA and faced severe violence because of it, requiring a trip to the hospital. I sustained a broken arm, a twisted ankle, and a concussion. Story 129. About 15 years ago, I passed a kidney stone. It was how I found out I wasn't drinking nearly enough water and was consuming far too much soda. Story 130. In terms of physical pain, an ingrown toenail on both sides is quite uncomfortable. I left it too long and tried to dig it out a few times, which ended up making it worse. I would occasionally bang it against the vacuum cleaner or a doorway, unaware of my surroundings, which is something you really need to pay attention to when you have an ingrown toenail. The sharp internal pain that would rush through me was almost overwhelming. It would make me sweat instantly and feel nauseous. Agony doesn't capture it. Mentally, well, that's another conversation altogether. I think I'll pass on getting another ingrown toenail. Story 131. Ruptured ectopic pregnancy. The actual rupture wasn't the worst part. It was painful and my body went numb on one side, but I attributed it to a random feeling that would go away by morning. And it did. I felt fine the next day and went to work as usual, unaware that I was internally bleeding for 15 hours. Then, it hit me like a tidal wave. My stomach immediately ballooned out, and I went into shock. By the time I got to the hospital, they said I was 40 minutes from death. Shortly after, I lost consciousness, and the following day, nurses described me as the color of a dolphin, saying they had never seen someone so gray and were glad to see me still here. No one thought I would make it that day. Fast forward 18 months, and I experienced it all again with my right fallopian tube. Story 132. My wife's infertility, the unsuccessful in vitro fertilization followed by an unsuccessful adoption, has led to immense pain. The pain she experienced and still experiences is the most painful thing I have encountered. Story 133. Dating someone who was such a monster made me feel like I didn't want to live anymore. He played so many games and hurt me so badly that I lost my ability to function as a person. Taking a breath hurts now, waking up seems terrifying, and I have lost myself to the point where I don't know if I can ever find myself again. Please, people, stop hurting others. If you have trauma, heal yourself. If you're broken, try to fix yourself. But stop using others to fill your broken pieces because you leave that person more broken than you ever were. And it's cruel. They just wanted to love you, and you destroyed them for it. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.